Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time, as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I want to look at another remake of a retro video game, Resident Evil 3 from Capcom. Now I talked about Resident Evil 2 Remake not too long ago and how much I loved it, so I was really excited when they announced Resident Evil 3 because of how much I loved Resident Evil 2. I kind of missed the original for a long time. I didn't play it until I was an adult. I enjoyed the original quite a bit, but I think it probably would have landed a little better for me way back in the day. I remember playing through Code Veronica with my brother when I was pretty little and really loving everything that they did with it. That was originally going to be Resident Evil 3, but because the development time was taking too long, they were working on a spin-off that ended up being a lot faster to produce, and so they slapped Resident Evil 3 on it, called it Nemesis, and made that the canonical third entry in the game, which is pretty interesting. I was excited that it was going to ditch the tank controls, of course, and the fixed camera angles. I think the action in Resident Evil 3, because they were pivoting toward action more, it didn't work as well in those fixed camera angles and with the tank controls. Not for me, at least. Having a heavier focus on the gunplay, where it's already kind of wonky, aiming up and down and holding stationary while you're shooting, just didn't work for me nearly as much. Now, that's not to say that it isn't a terrifying game. Going back and playing the original, Nemesis is very scary in the original game, and I love what they did with the game. It's not nearly as beefy as an entry like Resident Evil 2 or even Code Veronica, because it was originally going to be a spinoff, but there is a lot of substance there and there is a lot to like. So first and foremost, if you like the action Resident Evil 2, you'll really like it in Resident Evil 3. The gunplay is the same. You have more weapons, more options. You have like a full dodge roll mechanic. Everything about the heavier emphasis on action actually really works. And I really like what they did to kind of show that action heavy focus while also still focusing on the horror. In the first half of the game specifically, you have Nemesis pursuing you, and he is terrifying the entire way through. The more you meet him, the more beefy he gets. He starts off as this terrifying presence that has long range attacks, can jump in front of you, can cut you off, is really fast, and it's very terrifying trying to get away from him. You can try and fight, and you can get rewards for doing enough damage to him, but it's very, very difficult to take him down. And if you waste a ton of resources and you run out, and then you have to run away, you've lost tons of your resources that you're going to need to fight the zombies and get away from them as well. So it's a big risk-reward system, and I love what they did to implement that here. I think I took down Nemesis once, maybe twice in the early game. Got some extra weapon upgrades and some cool bonuses for that, but I didn't usually feel like it was worth it to try and fight him. I found it was much better to try and dodge roll and get away from him as fast as possible. That first half really nails the atmospheric horror that Resident Evil 3 is going for, and I love what Capcom did with it. The second half kind of let me down in a lot of ways. Like I said previously, Nemesis gets stronger each time you come into contact with him. These little scripted moments. He starts off with just regular Nemesis, and then all of a sudden he has a flamethrower, then a rocket launcher attached to him. He gets more and more terrifying as the game progresses. And then he'll start to evolve into these bigger forms. At one point he gets into like all fours, gets really huge, and is running around this arena that you have to fight him in. It's a really intense fight, and it pays off with a really cool ending, and it's fantastic. And you're fortunately saved by one of the other characters in this game, Carlos, who is a really fantastic character in this remake specifically. I liked him in the original, but I like what they did to revamp the story and make him more prevalent in this. You actually even get to play as him at one point, and you get to have a whole section that is very intense and very terrifying. Again, more action focused, but they really nailed the horror aspect for Carlos's section specifically. You're playing as Jill Valentine in this game. I failed to mention that from the original, which is really cool. You get to revisit her. I think her redesign is fantastic. I think everything about the visuals in this game really work for me. I think Capcom did a bang-up job of making this a really intense, scary experience with just the visual horror itself. And then the character models look fantastic as well. I think the story is also pretty good. I don't think it's nearly as good as Code Veronica was, but it is passable, and it's good for the lore. If you're a Resident Evil fan, you'll want this for the lore of the series, and it really has some good payoffs. But the latter half of the game kind of let me down in a lot of ways. Once you get past the point where Nemesis is constantly pursuing you, you'll get into the latter half of the game where you are kind of have scripted moments with Nemesis. Like I said, he's evolving, he's changing into like these terrifying forms. I think the most terrifying part of the second half for Nemesis is like a scripted event with a cutscene, you running from him. It's not really, there's no real scary payoff for the rest of it. It is more action focused than ever, and it just feels like a shoot 'em up game, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but for a Resident Evil title, having the second half of a game kind of lose the horror focus altogether is a big letdown for me. But fortunately, because the action is so good and because the gunplay is so refined and works so well, you can forgive it in a lot of ways. And I found myself really enjoying the experience from start to finish, even though the joy I felt was kind of diminishing over time. And that's kind of my biggest criticism with this. I think if they were going for this remake, I thought they should have really hit emphasis on that horror really, really well. Resident Evil 4 Remake down the line really dealt the horror out in perfect metered doses for you. They kept the horror throughout the entirety of the experience instead of segmenting it to the first half like Resident Evil 3 does. But like I said, if you enjoy the action aspect of Resident Evil 2 and you want to see what it would be like if you had more options, more mobility options, more weapons in this game, this is definitely the title for you. And if you are a hardcore Resident Evil fan, you like the lore of this game, you definitely need to pick up Resident Evil 3 Remake if you didn't go out and play the original. I'm going to give Resident Evil 3 Remake a gold rank. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.